My parents want to convince me to cut back on my wedding budget so they can pay for my sister's honeymoon after spending $15,000 on her wedding. Well, I got a little vengeful. My fiancé, 32 and I, 27, had been carefully budgeting everything, making sure to be practical while still planning the wedding we wanted. Nothing extravagant, but a celebration that felt right for us. At first, my parents seemed to agree with our plan until they didn't. It started with little comments here and there. My mom would mention how many couples waste money on weddings when they could be using it for more important things like savings or a down payment on a house. My dad would comment on how bad the economy was and how smart people knew when to adjust their expectations. At first, I assumed they were just being old-fashioned. My fiancé and I weren't being irresponsible with our budget. And besides, my sister had her wedding less than 2 months ago, a massive $15,000 event that my parents paid for without a second thought. And at the time, no one had told her to adjust her expectations. I still tried to listen to them. Maybe they were just worried about my future. Maybe after spending so much on my sister's wedding, they simply didn't have much left to contribute to mine. If that were the case, I would have understood. So I asked them directly. They dodged the question, instead telling me how proud they were that I was considering their advice. They kept talking about how mature it was to make financial sacrifices, how it showed wisdom. My mom even said that was what made me different from my sister. I was practical while my sister had always been more emotional. That should have been my first warning sign. But the real moment of clarity came when I accidentally discovered the truth. I stopped by their house one afternoon for a quick visit. The door was open, so I went in. My mom was in the kitchen cooking, and my dad was on the couch watching TV. But then my sister called, and the conversation that followed made my stomach churn. She was on speakerphone, her voice echoing throughout the room. She sounded excited, saying she had been so stressed about her honeymoon, but that everything would be okay now because mom and dad promised to help pay for. She went on and on about how she and her husband had been so worried about being able to afford the luxury resort she wanted, but thankfully our parents understood how important it was for her to have a proper honeymoon after such a big wedding. My parents reassured her, telling her they weren't going to let her worry about the money. After all, she had so much on her plate. They said helping her was their priority right now, and that's why they were being especially careful with unnecessary spending elsewhere. Unnecessary spending, my wedding. That's what their whole talk about cutting costs and being practical was all about. It wasn't about me or my future. It wasn't about financial wisdom. It was about diverting money from my wedding to her honeymoon. My sister, who had already had her $15,000 dream wedding, now deserved financial help again. And I was supposed to adjust my expectations for her sake. I had to physically force myself not to react at that moment. Instead, I waited until my mom hung up the phone. I kept a straight face, pretending I hadn't heard anything. I stayed long enough to finish my tea, made polite conversation, and then excused myself and left. They had tried to make me feel guilty about having a smaller, simpler, and cheaper wedding, all while planning to give that same money to my sister so she could fly off to some luxurious honeymoon suite. I felt foolish for ever thinking they had my best interests at heart. But I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to cry or beg for fairness. If they wanted me to cut costs, fine. But it wasn't going to be the way they expected. By the next morning, my anger had transformed into something sharper, more focused. If my parents wanted me to cut back on my wedding to help with other priorities, then I would. But my wedding wouldn't be the one to suffer. The first thing I did was call my fiancé and tell him everything. He wasn't surprised. He had always noticed the favoritism. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I had a plan. And that's how we ended up meeting with our wedding planner that very afternoon. Our wedding planner was amazing, organized, efficient, and completely willing to make changes. I told her that since my parents were so concerned about the cost, I would honor their wishes by cutting expenses. First, I trimmed the guest list. Anyone my parents insisted on inviting was off the list. No distant relatives I barely knew, no old family friends I hadn't seen since childhood, no business acquaintances who wanted to impress. That alone eliminated a huge chunk of the budget. Then I went through the list of things my parents had personally chosen. The venue was canceled. We had a beautiful alternative venue we originally wanted, but my mom had convinced me to book the one she preferred. Now we went back to our first choice: cozy, intimate, and half the price. The expensive catering company my dad had insisted on using because he had connections there was out. I replaced it with another vendor that offered amazing food for a fraction of the cost. The live band my mom had begged for because she thought it would be more elegant than a DJ was canceled. We were going with a DJ, and of course the full open bar that my parents considered essential because what's a wedding without top-shelf liquor? No, there would be beer, wine, and a signature cocktail. Nothing extravagant. Every decision I made was practical, reasonable, and completely justified. And yet I knew my parents would hate it. Did they want me to make sacrifices? Fine. But they were about to learn that if sacrifices were going to be made, they weren't going to be the ones deciding who would make them. And the best part? Since they had so kindly told me I needed to be responsible with my spending, I made sure I didn't ask them for a single penny from then on. I sent them an email with all the updates. No long explanations, no arguing, just a simple, polite message thanking them for their financial advice and letting them know that I had taken their wisdom seriously and made the necessary adjustments. I included the new guest list, venue, catering, and entertainment details, along with the significantly lower budget that my fiancé and I were now paying. Because let's be honest, they hadn't actually contributed financially to anything. Sure, they had opinions, plenty of them, but not a single penny. I had asked them for help a couple of times, not because I felt entitled to it, but because they were the ones insisting on a more extravagant wedding than my fiancé and I had originally planned. If they wanted the fancy venue, the high-end catering, the premium bar, the expensive extras, then it made sense that they would help pay for it, right? Apparently not. Not only did they not contribute a dime from the beginning, but they had plenty of requests for the wedding. But when I offered to have them pay for those things, since they were things they wanted, they said they didn't have any money to waste on unnecessary expenses because they had a lavish honeymoon to pay for. Every time I brought up the financial aspect, the response was the same. My mom sighed and reminded me that weddings shouldn't be about spending so much money. My dad launched into a lecture about how young couples these days don't know how to be financially responsible. And they both always came to the same conclusion. I should just cut costs. But here's the irony. They wouldn't cut the parts they had chosen. I had to cut my guest list, but theirs had to stay. I had to choose a cheaper dress, but my mom still wanted her custom-made dress for the mother of the bride look. I had to cut the DJ to save money, but my dad needed that full open bar for his friends. Someone please explain to me how that's supposed to make any sense. They had been so arrogant, so condescending, acting like I was some naive little girl who didn't understand financial responsibility. But when I actually did what they asked, when I took their advice and cut costs, suddenly I was the one ruining everything. It was almost laughable, so now I was taking complete control. My fiancé and I would pay for everything, but only for what we actually wanted. If my parents wanted to fund their own little show, they were welcome to throw a party for themselves. But my wedding would be exactly as we wanted it and nothing more. And now that all the decisions were made, I would just sit back and wait for the explosion. Update 1. Before I begin, I want to clarify something. My parents never offered to contribute any money toward my wedding. The only thing they offered was making demands. We were going to pay for those things ourselves, even though we told them it was beyond our budget. So I offered to pay for everything they wanted for the wedding, and they said no. That's when they started telling me I should be financially responsible. What I can translate that as is, parents with entitlement, cut everything we don't want and pay for what we do want. All while they were entitled to my sister's wedding and an equally or more luxurious honeymoon. That would be the summary of my first post. But moving on to the consequences of cutting costs, I didn't have to wait long. It started with my mom. She called me less than an hour after I sent the message, and she wasn't happy at all. She said she was surprised by my decision, that she didn't expect me to take things that far. She asked why I had eliminated so many important things. She didn't say it outright, but that's exactly what she meant. I reminded her that I was simply following her advice. Cut expenses. Keep things within a reasonable budget. Make the wedding simpler, less extravagant. More financially responsible, just like she and my dad had been preaching all along. She tried to rephrase it, saying that she never wanted me to go that far, that I should have talked to them first to discuss what to cut. I replied that I had talked to them repeatedly, and each time they told me to cut costs, and that's what I did. I could hear the irritation growing in her voice when she said, "It looks so small now, didn't you want to celebrate properly?" I asked her why she was more upset about the reduced budget than I was. After all, wasn't I the bride? If I was happy with it, why wasn't she? Silence. Finally, she said, "It's just not what I envisioned for you." There it was. It had never been about me. It never was. I asked her whose vision we were really talking about here, because if she had all these grand ideas for a dream wedding, then she should have had her own second wedding instead of trying to live it through mine. That ended the polite civil discussion. That's when she started telling me how awful I was for doing all this. I told her I was just following her advice and had done exactly what she and Dad wanted. I cut costs, saved money, made sure I wasn't being financially irresponsible. And then I hit her with the final blow. It's funny how you and Dad only cared about saving money when it was my wedding, but when it was your beloved daughter's wedding, money wasn't an issue. Boom, that was it. She went off, ranting about how I was twisting things, how my sister's wedding was different, how they were in a better financial position then, and how they had also sacrificed a lot for her wedding. I reminded her that my sister's wedding was only a couple of months ago. So why were they acting like it had been years ago? If they had truly been in a different financial position back then why did they still have extra money to splurge on their lavish honeymoon and all their other expenses? But suddenly, when it came to my wedding, they had to be frugal. They were free to pay for all the extravagant things they wanted at my wedding. But it was my wedding, my money, and I wasn't going to waste it. There was no response. Instead, she said I was making everything about money when family is more important than that. Oh, that phrase again. I told her that for them, family only comes first when it benefits them. I told her I had nothing more to say and ended the call. But things were just beginning because then my sister called. I hesitated to answer, but I knew that if I ignored her, she would keep calling until I answered. So I took a deep breath and answered. She started sweetly, congratulating me on making the smart decision, saying she had always thought my original wedding plans were a bit excessive, and that she was glad I had finally come to my senses. I knew what she was doing, trying to get me to agree with her. So I kept my response neutral, just a simple and a polite, thank you for calling. That's when she started to push. She said it was great that I was being more mindful of expenses, because that meant Mom and Dad could finally have a financial break. That it was a relief for them to know they didn't have to stress about my wedding costs, along with their other priorities. I asked her if those other priorities included their honeymoon. Absolute silence. Then a very defensive, what's supposed to mean by that? I told her I had overheard the conversation, that I knew our parents were perfectly fine financing their lavish, no-expense-spared honeymoon, while telling me to cut costs on my own wedding. Immediately, she went into damage control mode, saying she had misunderstood, that it wasn't like that our parents were just trying to help me make smart decisions. I told her I didn't need her to defend them. The facts spoke for themselves, and that's when the switch flipped. She went from sweet and rational to furious and accusatory in a second. She said I was being selfish, that I was trying to punish Mom and Dad for not spoiling me the way they spoiled her, that I was throwing a tantrum because I wasn't the favorite. That was ironic coming from her. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply following our parents' advice, cutting expenses, eliminating unnecessary spending, and being financially responsible. And if that meant eliminating things they wanted but refused to pay for, that was their problem. I told her she sounded scared. I asked her if she was afraid that now that she knew this, our parents might actually hold her accountable financially again. She didn't say anything. Then I hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time, waiting for it to ring again. It never did. I think the best wedding gift I received, and will ever receive, is that they were left speechless. Update 2. Everything was quiet for a day. Way too long. I knew my family well enough to know that silence didn't mean surrender, but regrouping. They were probably sitting around trying to figure out how to turn this to their advantage. And just in time, my dad called. Unlike my mom and sister, he was never the type to yell or try to guilt me directly. No, his approach was always rationality. He liked to act as the calm, reasonable one, the problem solver, the adult in the room. So I answered, bracing myself for the angle he was about to use. He started in a measured tone, saying he wanted to have a civil conversation about everything. He said my mother was very upset by my reaction and that they were surprised. Surprised? I reminded him that I did exactly what they wanted. They should be proud, happy that their daughter was finally listening to them. I could be just as rational as him. He said, of course we wanted you to be responsible, but that doesn't mean we wanted you to plan a cheap and embarrassing wedding. I asked him why my wedding was suddenly embarrassing when they had been so insistent on not spending too much. He ignored that. Instead of answering, he said I was misinterpreting their guidance, that they never wanted me to cut everything. I asked him what exactly he thought I had cut that was so unacceptable. The venue, it was still beautiful, smaller, yes, but elegant. The guest list, I cut out their distant friends and social circle, but if they weren't paying, why should I have to accommodate their guests? The catering, we were still going to have amazing food. Just not the ridiculously expensive stuff my mom had insisted on. The music, we didn't need a live band, especially since my fiancé and I preferred a DJ. I asked him which of those things was really the problem. There was a long pause, and then he finally said it wasn't about any particular thing, but about the principle of the matter. I'd heard that before. It was the vague excuse they used whenever they didn't have a real argument, but wanted to make me feel like I was wrong. I told him I understood now. It wasn't that I was cutting costs, but that I was removing their control from the equation. That was the real problem. They had never cared about saving money when it came to their decisions, their guest list, their vision for my wedding, which, let's remember, they weren't even paying for. The only time money became an issue was when I had the audacity to say no to things they wanted. He said I was making a mistake, that I would regret excluding my family from something so important. I told him my family was still invited, that they were welcome to come and celebrate with us, but not to dictate my wedding. He fell silent again and then asked if I really was going to go through with this. I told him yes, and that was that. Or at least I thought it was. Then the relatives came. First, my aunt. She called, acting concerned, saying she just wanted to check in, because she'd heard from my mother that I was going through something, I don't know, maybe wedding stress. I asked her what exactly she'd heard. She got vague, saying she knew there was tension between my parents and me, that she was so sad to hear that I was pushing them away over a silly wedding. I laughed because, of course, my mom had framed it that way. I told my aunt I wasn't pushing anyone away. I was just running my wedding the way that made sense to me. Then my cousin came along. She wasn't so subtle. She sent me a long message saying I was being selfish, because I was ruining the guest's experience just to spite my parents. I replied that if she didn't like the experience, she didn't have to come. More money saved. She didn't like that. I could see the dots appearing as she furiously typed her response, but before she could send it, I blocked her. She was my sister's favorite cousin, after all. She was going to side with her, and finally, my sister called back. But this time she didn't sound angry. She sounded smug. She said she was glad I had finally come to my senses and scaled things back. I asked what she meant. She said she had talked to mom and dad and they had come up with a solution that would work for everyone. I already knew I wasn't going to like this. She said that since my wedding was now much smaller, my parents thought of a better alternative. Instead, they thought it would be better to do something intimate. And since it was so intimate, they suggested we just combine it with a family trip. That way, they could celebrate with us in a more meaningful way. They wanted to turn my wedding into a family vacation. I asked her if she was serious. She laughed and said, of course, it makes so much more sense that way. Instead of having a small, awkward wedding, we could have a nice celebration during a trip. I asked her if that trip was the same one she and her husband were planning for their fancy honeymoon. She hesitated for a split second before saying, well, yes, but it would be a great bonding experience for the family. I laughed and laughed. And finally, I asked her if she really thought I was so stupid as to fall for that. I'm sure my parents have canceled their honeymoon, because the idea of my sister going on a fancy trip that would cost several times what my wedding would is not going to sit well with them. And with that, I officially uninvited her, along with my parents. And then I hung up, of course, update 3. I knew my parents would find out eventually. I had no doubt my sister would run straight to them, whining about how awful I had been, and how I had uninvited the family, my wonderful family. But it didn't happen as quickly as I expected. It took a few days after I hung up with my sister. But eventually my mom started bombarding my phone. When I didn't answer, my dad started calling. When I ignored that too, they switched to texts. They didn't ask why they were uninvited. No, they went straight to, how could you do this to us? We're your parents, we gave you everything. This behavior is disgusting. You're throwing away your family for nothing. The usual. I let them rant for a while, letting the messages pile up. And then, when I was ready, I picked up the phone and called them. I demanded to know if they really thought I would combine my wedding with my sister and her stupid husband's honeymoon. They had the audacity to sound offended. He said they couldn't afford to give my sister a honeymoon when I was having such a modest wedding. It wouldn't reflect well on them. I laughed. Then I said out loud, just in case my sister was listening in the background, that I had never heard anything more pathetic in my life. My dad, clearly irritated, tried to take a more reasonable approach. He said I was exaggerating. I told them that perhaps they were the ones exaggerating about how they would look. And if they think they look bad, it's because they are the kind of parents a bride could ever want. But my father kept insisting that I was misunderstanding everything. I asked him exactly what I was misunderstanding. Was it the fact that they had convinced me to scale back my wedding? Was it the fact that they immediately planned a lavish honeymoon for my sister and her husband? Or was it the fact that they suggested combining both under the guise of a family trip to save face? Next, I called my dear brother-in-law and I ripped him a new one as soon as he answered. I didn't even give him a chance to speak. I asked him if he had lost his damn mind. Did he really think he was going to get a free honeymoon by combining it with my wedding? They should pay for it themselves, not my parents, since they saved so much money on their wedding. They shouldn't try to manipulate everything to get a free honeymoon. I told him straight out that I always knew he was a coward, but I never thought he was so pathetic as to let my parents plan his honeymoon for him. And then, because I wanted to really hurt him, I asked him if he was so broke that he couldn't even take his wife on a proper trip without trying to leech money off anyone he could. But I wasn't finished yet. Because then I called his mother. I had only spoken to that woman a couple of times, but I knew exactly what kind of person she was. The respectable type. The kind who cares too much about appearances. And I made sure she knew exactly what her son had tried to do. I asked her if she was aware that her dear, wonderful son and his perfect wife had been planning to combine their honeymoon with my wedding in order to get a free vacation. I asked her how she felt knowing that her son was so shameless. I made sure to exaggerate, acting utterly outraged and disgusted that a man she had raised could stoop so low. And as I expected, she was speechless, absolutely mortified. She kept repeating, "That can't be true. That doesn't make sense. I need to talk to him about this," I told her. "Oh, please do." And just to drive the point home, I casually mentioned how disappointed I was that her son, who had been raised better than that, would try to take advantage of the family in that way. She was horrified. And then, well, the real fireworks started. Because she immediately called my mother. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I didn't need to be. All I know is that an hour later, I received a frantic message from my dad saying I had gone too far. And my mom was furious. She sent me a long, angry message saying that I had humiliated her in front of my brother-in-law's mother, that she had never felt more ashamed in her life, that I was vengeful, resentful, and completely out of control. I just smiled at my phone because that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted her to feel humiliated. And the best part? I still had one last trick up my sleeve. Because I didn't just uninvite them, I also sent out a new batch of invitations. And those invitations made it very clear who wasn't welcome at my wedding. And by the time they realize it, it will be too late. And I'll have the last laugh while they suffer in their own embarrassment. Update 4. It's time for a final update to my story, because the wedding has already happened, as well as my honeymoon. So there's no more drama with my parents. Well, they'll always know, but they are officially out of my life, and I'm out of theirs. Maybe my posts weren't the clearest. Many were written in the heat of anger. So a little recap is always helpful. My parents had second thoughts about paying for my sister's lavish honeymoon because it would look bad if people compared my wedding to hers, especially since they made a point of saying they were paying for my sister's wedding. There's nothing wrong with that. It's normal here for the bride's parents to pay for the wedding. But according to my parents, what would people say if they saw mine? And what would they say if they saw pictures of my sister's honeymoon? They would think there's a favorite child and that my parents are terrible. That's why they wanted a compromise, which I didn't accept and blew everything up. Now let's continue where I left off, with the invitations. The first invitations arrived soon, and my parents found out because someone showed them to them. So I started receiving messages like, "Not only are you not inviting us, but you're also humiliating us." But I expected to get many more messages, and yet it only amounted to a few. The simple reason is that they were busy with the messages they were receiving themselves. Yes, it's not common, but the invitation explained why my parents weren't invited. I didn't want any nosy relatives hearing my parents' version of events and calling to ask, "Why aren't your parents invited?" in a silly voice. So I gave them something to focus on so they wouldn't focus on me. The consequences were simple. First, they didn't attend my wedding, which made it 10 times better. Second, they didn't pay for my sister's honeymoon. It wasn't my main goal, but that's what happened. And as if that weren't enough, my call to my sister's mother-in-law caused havoc in their marriage. You know what the husband did when his mother called my sister and him all sorts of names? He didn't defend his wife. And since he didn't, my sister filed for divorce. Simple as that. At least my parents should thank me for saving them the money for the honeymoon. I made them financially responsible, but they won't thank me for it. All because they are angry with me and have cut me off from the family, as they call it. Which is fine by me, because I've done the same. The only regret I have in this life is not convincing them to pay for that honeymoon, because along with the wedding, it would have been hilarious. We're talking about a marriage of less than a year, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Interesting values for someone as rational as my father. This logic hasn't helped them at all, because with my invitations and the fact that people love to gossip, everyone in their social circle has heard my story. So they haven't escaped unscathed. If my mother had agreed to pay for the shrimp and lobster she wanted for my wedding, none of this would have happened. But now I know they really couldn't afford it, because the wedding had already been a huge expense for them, and the honeymoon was already going to be difficult. What a financial burden that would have been. At least I've been a better daughter than they think, and I've saved them that money. It's time to say goodbye and thank them, because they've been with me through this whole wedding journey. Edit. I need to correct some things I said in my post. My parents did eventually pay for the honeymoon, but the only person who went was my sister. I didn't know this because during that time she only posted sad things on social media. Posts she was making during the honeymoon while lamenting her marriage. So let me clarify. My parents' situation wasn't a financial responsibility. It was a financial disaster.